Let me just say a quick word of introduction for each of our panelists. Go left to right. Bob Inman is the Richard King Mellon Professor of Finance here at the Wharton School. His expertise centers appropriately on public finance and fiscal policy, particularly as it relates to infrastructure. And as I said, I've known Bob for a good number of years, and he is one of those people who clearly, I think in my head, has forgotten more about fiscal policy than most folks would remember. So it's great to have him here and to weigh in on this important set of issues. Representative-elect Madeleine Dean is the Congresswoman-elect for Pennsylvania's 4th District, which is majority of Montgomery County and a little bit of Berks County, if you're familiar with that, north and slightly west of the city. She served in the General Assembly in Pennsylvania since 2012 and has, I think, a fascinating career before that. Started out graduating from law school and then taught English literature at LaSalle and then was elected to the General Assembly. So congratulations to you. And was a student actually at Fells when I took a couple of courses to hone her chops while I was at Fells. Ben Ritz is the director of the PPI Center for Funding America's Future. And prior to PPI, Ben worked at a related organization, I'll say at least in the same family, the Bipartisan Policy Center, where he focused on reforming Social Security. So Ben clearly takes on the easy ones. He has a master's in public policy from American University, where he also got his undergraduate degree. So I'm going to start with Ben just to expound a little bit on the report and to take up Will Marshall's sort of overview to just to give us a little more sense of the meat and the themes of this important report. So Ben?
Thank you, and thanks for having us here. So we set out to write this report. We started focusing on this topic roughly around February earlier this year. And around that time, two big things had happened. In December, Congress and the president had passed a $2 trillion tax cut. And then in February, they passed a big spending package. And these two things together added several $1 trillion to expected deficits and debt over the next decade. So this also came at an interesting time because during the Obama era, there was a lot of discussion about the problems of growing debt and deficits. There were efforts made to combat those issues. But the interesting thing was that during the Obama era, making sudden spending cuts or tax increases would have been economically harmful. Whereas now is sort of the time when most economists would say you should be reducing those costs, and instead this was a time where the current administration was making them bigger. The other thing we wanted to focus on in this report is the intergenerational angle. In addition to the problems of pushing more and more debt onto ours and future generations, there's also an issue with the investments that are being made in the long-term health of the economy. When Congress last tried to handle the debt and deficit, instead of going after programs that were growing significantly on the spending side, and instead of raising adequate revenues, they made cuts to a lot of programs that were particularly harmful and not where one would go for budget savings. So just one statistic that I thought was particularly interesting as we were researching this report, prior to 1980, the federal government spent about 2.5% of gross domestic product on three big public investments: education, infrastructure, and scientific research. Today that would have been worth roughly $470 billion. And instead, last year, the government spent only $300 billion. So the amount of money that is being put into these long-term investments in the future and that will benefit future generations and create economic growth is being cut at the same time that the burden on those generations is growing. And so we wanted to use this opportunity to talk about those issues, bring attention to it, and try to start a conversation about how we can have a budget that focuses more on creating long-term prosperity.
Great. I'm going to turn to Bob Inman now and with this question. Bob, You have been a part of efforts and have certainly been on the receiving end of efforts to sound, I suspect, a variety of wake-up calls around these kinds of foreboding fiscal issues that confront us. And question on this one is, how, if you were trying to frame this for your students, how do you think about the consequences of the choices that we're making or avoiding right now? And we'll talk a little bit later about the politics, but what in your mind is at stake here, and how serious is it?
Well, David, I will comment that at some early point in my public finance class, I first off thank the students for my Social Security and Medicare, and then I say, and the best thing that you can do is not count on it. You get yourself a nice private pension plan, defined contribution rather than defined benefit, and save like crazy because it's coming your way. And I don't know if that sticks, but that really is the central issue. And I think Ben's report does a very nice job of clarifying what the tension is. It's a demographic shift in program and a program structure that's in place and seems immutable to any kind of significant change. Namely, the elderly generation, of which I'm soon to be a member, is growing relative to the working generation, and then as a consequence, there are going to be fewer people paying for more people's Medicare and Social Security. The other program that's big, of the big three that Will had mentioned, is Medicaid. And that's a program that I would argue was wisely expanded during the Obama's efforts to re-stimulate the economy during our last big recession. But it is a very expensive program. There's a significant population that is poor. And by poverty in the Medicaid program, the numbers reach up into the $35,000 area of income level of qualifying. So this is a significant portion of folks who do qualify for Medicaid. So you've got these three big programs, and Ben's report, I think, makes this important point, which is these programs are growing. The tax cut, as a consequence, reduce the revenue to pay for them, and the only way we're paying for them in the end is by borrowing money. That means future interest rates are going to be higher, or interest payments are going to be significantly higher. And the squeeze that Ben gave you the fact of, that is education, infrastructure, and R&D getting smaller and smaller and smaller, the source of that squeeze is the fact that future generations are going to have to pay debt, and they're going to be confronting their own debts, and as a consequence, there's going to be significant squeeze on infrastructure, education, and R&D. The other comment I would make is that if you look at international evidence on what is the real source of long-run future growth of an economy, it is exactly the things that are being squeezed: infrastructure, education, and R&D. Those are the sources of productivity. Those are the sources of future growth. Those are the sources of your ability to repay debt. So we're immiserating ourselves on two dimensions. We're creating this enormous obligation and reducing our ability to pay for it. Madeline is going to be going to
pressure.
is going to be going to Congress, and this is an issue that just simply can't be avoided. And the only question is, when does it come home in a way that is really apparent and creates the kind of pressure needed to face reform. The sooner you face it, obviously, the easier it'll be. But how to get people to pay attention to that obligation and those necessities, I do not, I do not have a clue. One of the great things about my career is I'm an economist, not a policymaker or a politician. So I can just say, here's a problem.
I decided a while back that most things in this world fit into the category of what, so what, and now what. So we've proceeded through the what and something of the so what, and now we get to talk about the now what. And this is Representative Electing. This is the world that you're entering and the set of challenges that you have. So I guess threshold question for me is, you've been through, I'm sure, an exhausting campaign, talking to lots of people who have lots of things to say about what you should be doing or shouldn't be doing. how much did this issue resonate as you were knocking doors or attending coffee clatches? And how does it resonate with you and your understanding based on the life experience and your experience in General Assembly?
Well, first, thanks for including me here tonight. And I have to correct for the record, at LaSalle University, I was not a professor of literature. My colleagues there would be horrified. I was a professor of writing, rhetoric, ethics. And we developed an undergraduate legal writing course, business writing, all different kinds of things. So enjoyed helping young people craft their words and their arguments and harness actual facts and information as they made their arguments. I have to tell you, I'm at the end of 2 extremely exciting weeks. To have run in this election in Pennsylvania, having brand new districts and taking my legislative experience from the Pennsylvania House and now having the chance to serve in Congress at what I think is probably one of the most critical times in my adult life that our country has ever faced is just extraordinarily exciting. I am honored for the chance to serve. I feel an urgency to serve. I am undaunted by all the stuff that you guys know so much about, but I look forward to learning from you. So that's why I'm glad you really invited me here. And a couple of things that I was thinking about in response to your question, because I do want to say one other thing that happened to me these last 2 weeks. My son was married on Saturday.
Hey.
Of all places at Congress. So imagine this week, orientation in DC and then right into a wedding at, of all places, Congress Hall, Cape May. He booked it well before I was ever running for Congress. But to just inform you about on the doors, knocking on doors, going to town halls, what do people care about? The number one bread and butter issue people care about, as they expressed it to me, and this was true for other candidates, was their concern about health care. Healthcare, healthcare, healthcare. What are you going to do? How are you going to make sure you protect our healthcare, get us greater access to it, reduce premiums, put a greater check on prescription drug costs, all of those things. That was sort of the bread and butter issue number one. Other issues that really resonated with folks, infrastructure. If you guys are smart and you get down there, you'll have a chance in a bipartisan way, I hope, to do something about infrastructure. And at some point, maybe I'll have a chance to tell you how I'm informed by my work in the Pennsylvania House, how we actually passed a bipartisan infrastructure bill. And by God, I hope we have the wisdom and the ability to do that at the federal level. But David, what really resonated with me at the doors was the notion of good governance. Because every time I was at a door, what I would do is I'd give my little spin, my little pitch about who I am and why I believe that I should, earn your vote. But I'd always throw it back to the person at the door. And I remember time after time, and one time in particular, I was knocking doors in the rain, got caught in the rain without an umbrella, and chatted with a man and told him my spiel. And I said, but tell me more importantly, what do you care about? And his single word, he literally said one word, decency. That's what I heard resonating in addition to this notion of will you do your job, will you be fiscally responsible, will you bring us investments in education and infrastructure and corrections to the Affordable Care Act that will make it actually affordable and universal. But will you be a part of good governance? Will you be a part of decency and actually working through in an ethical way, having conversations across the aisle? People care desperately about the priorities in terms of debt and spending. They get the notion, I think, and maybe your report, I really enjoyed your report, and it informs me, but it also tells me what I was hearing at the doors. People's lives are super busy, and so they got that what was supposedly argued as a terrific tax cut for the middle class, they recognized it didn't happen, that it was actually false, and that what it was a deficit exploding tax cut for the very, very, very wealthiest among us. And then what happens is the argument becomes, well, what do we do about Medicare? What do we do about Social Security? What do we do about Medicaid? But I guess we got to cut those things. I'll be informed by your expertise and academic smarts, but as a member of the Pennsylvania House, I never fell for that kind of stuff, and I won't fall for it in Congress. I do feel very strongly about what people care about, and they care about growing the middle class. They care about growing jobs in the economy. They care about educating their kids. And so I'll be a part of that and responsible fiscal policy.
Great. Well, I do want to take you up on the offer a little bit later to come back to your thoughts on infrastructure and partnerships. But But first I want to, because since you brought it up, I'm going to ask both Ben and Bob to weigh in on the tax cut that Congress passed at the president's urging. How much worse did that make things?
I think that there's two ways to look at it. There's how much worse did it make it from a quantitative perspective versus what it did to both the debate and the tone in DC. From a quantitative perspective, it was bad, but not wasn't apocalyptic. It added $2 trillion to deficits and debt, which is bad over the next 10 years, but a lot of the provisions are set to expire within the next 10 years. And if they're allowed to expire, the long-term debt impact won't be horrific, whereas if it's made permanent, then the problem gets a whole lot worse. But I think something that it did that was particularly harmful was what it did to the discussion, and as Congresswoman-elect Dean said, to go to people and say, we cut taxes for people who don't need it, and now we have to come and touch your Social Security and Medicare. That doesn't work for people, and it shouldn't work for people. I think when President Obama left office, he left the country in a relatively good position to tackle these issues. Revenue and spending were both at a relative level where both parties had worked hard to get it, and it was sort of a fair starting point. And then this administration just walked it all back. And that also, in addition to having the equity issue of how can you cut taxes for rich people while coming after programs that support me, in addition to that, it also begs the question that I've heard a lot of progressives ask, which is, why do we go to the effort of putting the budget in order if it's just going to get blown up the next time someone else takes control? You look back to the Clinton era where they balanced the budget, and then a few years later it got unbalanced, and then you look at the situation now. And I just think that the tax cut and the way it was handled do a tremendous harm to people's willingness and interest in addressing these issues that they know should be addressed but don't know how they should be.
Bob, what's your thoughts on that question?
David, two things. I think back to the drivers of growth in some sense, investment, R&D, and human capital. On the investment side, there's public and private investment, and one would have hoped that all of this money that was coming back from overseas, perhaps, and that the profits saved would have found a really attractive private activity to put the money into, which would have been perfectly fine. That would have led to higher private capital, higher wages, and ostensibly growth. Unfortunately, the bundle of private projects available to firms was not all that attractive relative to the amount of money that was flowing back. So what did the firms do with it? They bought back shares, which drives up share prices. So it essentially, I think the numbers now are coming back at around 40 to 50% of the cash that flowed back went into stock buybacks. That's not going to give you particularly high returns in the terms of long run capital accumulation. So did we know this beforehand? Yeah, we did. I think the evidence that at least I am aware of from the Bush tax cuts where significant amounts of the funds went into stock buybacks. And so the question is, what was the ostensible target of all of this? Potentially correct, lower the tax on capital, leads to capital accumulation and growth, provided there are a sufficient number of productive private projects to make that attractive relative to the option of buying back shares. And I think what we found was, for the most part, or not for the most part, for a significant part, the stock buyback proved to be a more attractive option. So the policy really could be a good policy in the sense of cutting taxes on capital, but was this one did it offer the returns that we might have hoped for? I think the argument is probably not. And so the dilemma, I think, that Ben raises is we're now looking at significant deficits, and the question is, how are we going to close them? And the answer, I suspect, is going to be to look, as was implied, the entitlement programs, and also continue squeezing of discretionary spending. And what's in discretionary spending? The three things that arguably are an engine for growth: R&D, human capital, and public infrastructure. So that's the dilemma that we've placed ourselves in. Whether we're going to have the ability or the courage to get our way out of it, I'm not at all certain. David, if you'll allow me a chance to ask Representative Dean a question. One of the areas that I do a lot of my research on is state and local government finance. How do you guys do what you've been doing? And it's really, I'm doing a project with a colleague, and some of our early results are really fairly striking. The talk of an infrastructure crisis. Yeah, that's true. I mean, there are bridges falling down in places, but if you look at the aggregate amount of investment by state and local government in public infrastructure, it has been rising every year since 1992. So have the state and local governments been immiserating public infrastructure? In the aggregate, no. I think there are areas that are obviously suffering, but in the aggregate, the state and local sector is investing. Okay, are they borrowing too much? The answer to that is, well, when they're in a recession, they borrow. But when they're in a recovery, they save. So what you get is the kind of smoothing out of taxes over a business cycle. You borrow in recessions and you save during upturns. And on balance, over the horizon, it looks pretty stable. That is, in fact, there's small accumulations of surplus in the state and local sector. So the question I would put to Representative Dean is, how the heck did you do that?
Imagine in Harrisburg. And please feel free to call me Matt or Madeline.
Okay.
Not so formal with me. You know, I'm coming from, and it's a very interesting pivot. I've been 6.5 years a state representative. My term ends the 30th of this month. After 6.5 years, I came in a special election to fill Josh Shapiro's unexpired term when he went to county government before becoming Attorney General for Pennsylvania. And I have had the honor of being on our Appropriations Committee in the Pennsylvania House. It is the meatiest of the work in Harrisburg. I have enjoyed it immensely. It's such a terrific place to learn and to recognize up close and personal how we budget. And I say how we budget is how we define ourselves. It really reveals our priorities or our failure of priorities in many instances. And how did we do it? And in Harrisburg, we failed many times, as you will know. We had one budget cycle where we went 9 months late, leaving schools and county providers and many nonprofits wondering how they're going to get along. This past election cycle, it's related to an election cycle, budget cycle, we actually passed the budget slightly early on time without what we did 1 year ago, which was borrow, I think, dramatically poorly. We were in a $1.5 to $2 billion deficit. And to fill that gap, the majority party chose borrowing against the tobacco settlement fund, of all things, which to me was an absurdity, fiscally irresponsible way of moving forward and paying our bills, or kind of failing to pay our bills, frankly. But some things that we've done, and maybe this is a chance for me to talk about infrastructure, if that's all right. In terms of, I came in the spring of 2012. And right away, pretty shortly after that budget cycle, we were talking about infrastructure. This was a Corbett administration. I'm a Democrat, and we were Democrats in the minority at that time. The Corbett administration, under the real shepherding of Transportation Secretary Barry Shoke, worked diligently, in earnest, on an infrastructure bill. And so imagine me, I'm a freshman Democrat in the minority, and I cared deeply about the notion of infrastructure, and most people thought we're not going to be able to get it done because we were so deeply polarized and divided. Just a very anecdotal experience that taught me an awful lot. Barry Shoke, Secretary Shoke, was setting up roundtables with legislators. So 10 o'clock, meet in whatever room in the Capitol, all are invited. And so I remember racing to one of these meetings. It was an open meeting for legislators to talk about the so-called decade of investment that the Corbett administration was trying to put forward. And I ran in about 10 minutes late, and I sat down, and I see I'm with Barry Shoke and his whole team, and there's not a single other legislator there. And so I said, Mr. Secretary, I'm so embarrassed. Sorry, I'm late. Obviously, you don't have, sorry, not at all. You have other things to do. You don't have to meet with me. He said, absolutely not. Let's have the conversation. And so they were prepared to show your legislative district and what a decade of investment through this infrastructure package would look like. And so Barry Shoke puts down this terrific PowerPoint showing my legislative district, and it had not one project. It actually had, that's a lie. On Route 63, there was a half of a project that bridged both of our districts, two different districts. And he was shocked, and I was shocked. That started a robust conversation that he and I had over the course of the next 8 or 9 months, whatever it took, to get this bill passed, with just little old freshman me. But he recognized he needed to build the goodwill of legislators, both sides of the aisle, senior and junior and freshmen like me. And so that actually gives me some hope, because we got that done. They needed Democratic votes because they knew they couldn't get their whole caucus, even though their whole caucus would have done it. They needed some of our votes, and that made, I think, an important difference. It's one of the proudest votes I ever cast in the Pennsylvania House. I hope that that same investment, and it's ongoing, sustained dollars. It's not a one-time borrowing to fix a few bridges. It's ongoing, sustained dollars year after year after year. I hope we get to meet that with the federal dollars. Again, I am informed it's going to take bipartisan effort, and it's going to take people of goodwill on both sides of the aisle to say we've got to do this, because it will grow our economy. It will stimulate jobs. It will, help kids of my son's generation want to live and work here in our areas.
Terrific. I'm going to throw a question to Ben of this type. You make the point, and Bob's reinforced this, that in investments in human capital and R&D and infrastructure or productivity creation investments. We just talked about physical infrastructure. And I'm wondering, it seems to me that voters, people, man on the street, intuitively understand, because they see it and travel physical infrastructure and maybe understand the benefits and the payoffs around those investments. Do you think they bring the same kind of awareness to the human capital and the kind of innovation and R&D investments? Or is that part of the struggle in getting people to believe?
I think that with regard to human capital investments, education, I think they do understand that pretty well. I know at least in the Democratic Party that finding more ways to create access to education has been a very big topic of discussion. And I think people acknowledge the benefits there. And I don't have the number right off the top of my head, but our polls showed that was one of the ways that voters were most supportive of increasing growth and reducing income inequality. So I think there is that there. Scientific research, I think, is very different, and I don't think most voters have. It's hard to relate to, because a lot of it takes place in labs. The experiments can be very esoteric. Some members of Congress every year love to read out loud on the floor some of the experiments that sound the most absurd to lay people, and they use that to create the impression of wasteful spending here. But the fact is that government investment has contributed a lot to the domestic economy. The internet is a result of government investment that laid the foundation for it. GPS is a result of government investment. A lot of cures for various diseases are results of government investment. All of these technologies that are now the foundation of our economy would not have been possible without those scientific investments. But the other thing they have that makes them different from the human capital and infrastructure is they take a very, very long time to pay off. According to the Congressional Budget Office, it's something like 10 years before you start to see any benefit, and 20 years or 30 years before you get the full benefit. So it's very difficult to make that relatable, but it's also an incredibly important part of how you stimulate growth over the long term.
Yeah. I'm going to take this chance to slip in a quick book recommendation, which is sort of related to what we're talking about. It's a book I just read called The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis. Michael Lewis is the Moneyball of Moneyball fame, and it's an interesting reminder about what government does, and that government actually does useful things and important things to our health and safety and well-being and future. So I think it's in the line. It's a decidedly non-scholarly book, so if you want to break from your studies, for those of you who are in studies, I recommend that to you. But Fifth Risk, Michael Lewis, I have no interest whatsoever in the book, so there. So I wanted to maybe ask a last set of questions, and you're welcome to ask each other questions along this way, more on the kind of political dynamics of the situation that we have in front of us, which I'll frame as tough choices. And I was remembering I was with Marjorie Margolis a couple of days ago, actually on Election Day, who I think when she was a member of Congress must have represented at least some part of the district that you're in now.
Yeah, the eastern part.
Yep. And for those of you who weren't around at the time, then Congresswoman Margolis, who was the first member of Congress, female member of Congress elected on her own steam in Pennsylvania, and now fortunately, and I think terrific, there are now 4. But she maybe made her mark on the political history by casting a very tough vote, I think in 1993, in support of President Clinton's budget, which I think most would acknowledge cost her seat. So she ended up as a one-term member of Congress. So that doesn't give us an enormous amount of optimism about maybe the consequences of tough choices. But I'm just be interested in hearing from any of you. Madeline, you've lived this. You've had to make some tough choices. How do you interpret? How do you explain? How do you rationalize tough choices to voters? How do you make sort of scholarly sense of them, if that's possible? Because it almost seems, as I said, counterintuitive, like I'm asking you to support something that you're going to think is not in your short-term benefit, but trust me here that for you, your kids, your grandkids, this is the right thing to do. So framework of tough choices, anyone can volunteer on that topic.
Well, maybe I'll jump in. I came to public service in my 50s, so I'm not young and maybe not shy. I'm also the youngest of 7 children, so I think that gives you some grit and some tough making choices and having to stand up for them with 5 older brothers in particular. But in my public service, when I am asked to consider voting on a particular bill, and sometimes I do get very vocal opposition from voters, constituents who come into my district office or who call me or who email me. And now as I'm pivoting to the federal level, I'm getting that also on particular issues. I just feel very comfortable saying that this is what I believe is in the best interest of us long term. So if you talk about the issue of education, for example, investment in pre-K, I have been fighting for that at the state level. We know that even though I might not see the results of that, this year in our budget, we just added about, I think, 3,000 seats for children who are 3 and 4 years old for pre-K, assisted pre-K. We know that investment, and this is the argument I make, and Ben's report reflects it as well, the investment you make there, you're not going to see the results tomorrow or in 5 years or in 6 years, but man, oh man, think of that investment over time. And we do know that it has economic sense. It's the right thing to do also morally, but it also has economic sense. Some estimates, I don't know what your research shows, that $1 invested in pre-K now will save $8, $9, $10 down the road in underemployment, dropouts of high school, incarceration costs, and all other underproductivity. So it's just the smart economic thing to do, and I just try to make that argument. I fight vehemently on the issue of gun violence. I have been fighting on that issue for 6 years. It's not a popular, easy issue to talk about in Harrisburg. Many of my colleagues can't even say the word gun, but I started the PA Safe Caucus, and people would say, well, you're not going to really see any results as a result of that fight. Why do you spend so much time and energy on it? I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. I think the gun violence toll in this country reveals our inhumanity, frankly. And that if a single bill, and I'm happy to tell you, we just passed a single bill this year, first time we had any bills come out of judiciary and get a vote on the floor, and we passed one that had to do with domestic violence, that guns must be taken, weapons must be taken from those who have a final order PFA, protection from abuse, And people would say to me, well, what's the point of that, Mad? You're not going to see any real results. Well, actually, we will. We'll save lives doing that. The other argument is often you're not going to see it in your term or your tenure, or you're not going to end all gun violence, or you're not going to educate every child. The perfect can't be the enemy of getting something done, frankly, and saving a life, getting a kid through pre-K. So I like making those arguments that the long-term investment is what matters, and I hope I never face the kind of devastating choice that Marjorie faced, but she faced it with courage and took the right vote. And literally, they chanted "Bye bye Marjorie" on the floor of the House as she cast that vote. That's the kind of public servant you need. Somebody who's not worried about her next term, but somebody who is looking at the big picture. I have confidence that if I continue to make the arguments, I hope voters will return me.
Great. Bob or Ben, how do you want to add to this?
I certainly think that Representative Dean has a much better understanding of managing the politics of this than probably either Bob or I. But I think one important aspect of getting the public to support this sort of thing is demonstrating that everybody has skin in the game and everybody can benefit from it. You look at the tax bill, for example. There were clearly some winners and some losers, and arguably more losers than winners, and that made it pretty unpopular. Some people thought that they were getting screwed over while someone else was benefiting at their expense. One of the interesting things about these bigger political deals where you're willing to put everything on the table is that by creating fewer specific interest winners, it demonstrates more that we're trying to tackle a big national problem as opposed to trying to take money from you and give it to someone else. And then I think it's like Madeline said, it's about making the case that this is a long-term benefit and you won't necessarily see the benefit today, but 10, 20 years from now, you're going to be very glad that your elected officials did that. And to some extent, you can look back at like when I gave those examples of research and development, pointing back to instances where policymakers made those smart investments, years, decades ago, and being able to look at the benefit now. That is a good way of showing people that that this isn't just a theoretical argument. This is a very real benefit that will materialize, and you have to work with and to some extent trust your elected officials to do the right thing.
Right. Bob, before we turn to you, I'm going to kick it to the audience and after Bob's response, so get a good question warmed up and we'll have plenty of time to talk. Bob?
Oh, David, just really briefly, David and I have been in a fight, not personally, we've been on the same side of this fight of lowering a particularly onerous tax in Philadelphia called the wage tax. It's been a long fight, but I think it's been successful. The tax's been going down significantly over the last 25 years, and I keep asking myself, how the heck did that happen? It happened, I think, for two reasons. One, we kept talking the facts. The facts are it hurts you. The facts are it hurts you. Don't avoid the facts. The facts are it hurts you. Similarly, keep talking the facts about this debt, the debt issues. The second thing that happened was the facts began to take on a human face, which, and I'll give you one very quick example. In one effort during one mayor's term to raise the wage tax, who testified against raising the wage tax? It was the African American ministers. And what did they say? You raise the wage tax, we're going to benefit because the money would come to our neighborhood, but I tell you who's going to lose. It's going to be the kids graduating from our high schools who don't have job opportunities in this city. Namely, there was a face on the fact. It wasn't just a regression that David and I had done, but there was a face on the fact. So I think the facts coupled with a face can begin to make the difference. And the last thing I would say is, and this seems far afield, is campaign finance reform, please God. And why? Strengthen the hand of political parties. You need some institution with a long-term stake in the game. Madeline's going to be there for 10, 15 more years, we hope.
Oh, thank you. Thank
Marjorie was there for 2, but the Democratic Party is around for the long haul, as is the Republican Party. So strengthen the financing ability, this is a point of view, obviously, of the political parties to stand behind Marjorie when she makes a tough vote. That to me is you need an organization with a long perspective and a stake in the game over the long haul, not the kind of highly diffused 435 individual agents all trying to get reelected. That makes life very difficult for them. So, but I think the main thing for me is facts, 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 and put a face on the facts, and you begin to make some progress, I think, in having this stuff stick.
And persistence over time. Well, just since Madeline corrected her own record, my misstatement, I want to correct what Bob said. I would trust upside down and sideways any regression that Bob would run. I would not trust the same regression that I might sort of meddle around with, because just want to set that straight.